England, 1558. A young woman ascends a throne built on blood and uncertainty. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of the infamous Henry VIII and the executed Anne Boleyn, inherits a nation fractured by religious strife and foreign threats. For nearly half a century, she would rule with an iron will, but her greatest legacy remains a paradox. Known to history as the Virgin Queen, she claimed to be married only to her kingdom. Yet, behind the stiff collars and lead-white makeup, a centuries-old question lingers. Was this title a genuine vow of purity, or a masterstroke of political theater designed to protect her power? The crown was a heavy burden for a woman in a world ruled by men. From the moment the scepter was placed in her hand, the pressure to find a consort was relentless. Her advisors, led by the pragmatic William Cecil, viewed her womb as a diplomatic asset. They saw a husband as a necessity for stability and an heir as a safeguard against civil war. But Elizabeth saw marriage as a cage. To wed a foreign prince was to surrender England to a rival power. To wed a local noble was to invite jealousy and rebellion. She began a delicate dance of courtship and refusal. To understand Elizabeth's refusal to marry, one must look at the ghosts of her past. Her father, Henry VIII, had famously cycled through 6 wives in a desperate quest for a male heir, leaving a trail of execution and heartbreak in his wake. Elizabeth had seen firsthand how a queen's life depended on her husband's favor and her ability to produce a son. The memory of her mother, Anne Boleyn, dying on the scaffold for failing to keep the king's interest, haunted her. For Elizabeth, marriage was not a romantic union, but a potential death sentence that she was determined to avoid at all costs. Despite her public stance on celibacy, there was one man who occupied a singular place in her heart: Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Their bond was forged in the fires of the Tower of London, where both had been imprisoned by Elizabeth's sister, Mary I. Dudley was handsome, charismatic, and shared Elizabeth's love for hunting and intellectual debate. As queen, she showered him with titles and estates, and their intimacy was the talk of the court. Many believed they were lovers in secret, and rumors swirled that the queen had found a man she might finally be willing to risk everything for. The Tudor court was a hive of whispers and espionage. Every look, every touch, and every closed door was analyzed by spies from Spain, France, and Rome. These foreign powers were desperate to find proof of the queen's immorality to delegitimize her rule. They bribed laundresses and ladies-in-waiting for news of her physical health and the state of her bedsheets. The mystery of the queen's virginity was not just a matter of personal privacy. It was a battleground for the soul of England. If Elizabeth was found to be unchaste, the very foundations of her Protestant throne could crumble under the weight of scandal. Realizing that her singleness was her greatest leverage, Elizabeth began to craft a powerful public image. She transformed herself into the Virgin Queen, a secular alternative to the Virgin Mary. By remaining unmarried, she became the mother of her people and the bride of England. This carefully constructed persona allowed her to navigate a patriarchal world by transcending the traditional roles of womanhood. She used her suitors as diplomatic pawns, dangling the promise of marriage to keep foreign kings at bay, all while never intending to say, "I do." The myth of the Virgin Queen was her most effective weapon of statecraft. However, the walls of the palace could not keep out the most scandalous rumors. Inside the royal household, the ladies of the bedchamber were the only ones who knew the truth of the queen's private life. These women, chosen for their loyalty, guarded the queen's secrets with their lives. Yet, even among them, there were stories of late-night visits and muffled laughter coming from the Queen's inner sanctum. Was Elizabeth truly living a life of chaste devotion, or was she simply the world's most successful mistress of disguise? The lines between her public duty and her private desires became increasingly blurred as the years passed without a husband. From the Archduke of Austria to the Duke of Anjou, Europe's elite lined up for a chance at Elizabeth's hand. Each courtship was a meticulously choreographed performance. Elizabeth would flirt, exchange letters, and even grant private audiences, only to pull back at the final moment with a list of impossible demands. These courtships lasted decades, exhausting her suitors and frustrating her advisors. To the world, she was the unattainable prize, but to her enemies, she was a Jezebel playing a dangerous game. Every rejected proposal added another layer to the mystery that defined her reign and protected England's independence. The greatest threat to the Virgin Queen image came in 1560 with the sudden and mysterious death of Amy Robsart, Robert Dudley's wife. Found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck, rumors immediately flew that Dudley had murdered her so he could marry the Queen. The scandal rocked the nation and forced Elizabeth to distance herself from the man she loved. If she married Dudley now, the world would believe she was complicit in the crime. The tragedy of Amy Robsart effectively ended any hope of a legal union between Elizabeth and Dudley, cementing her path toward a life of perpetual singleness. As the decades rolled by, the cult of the Virgin Queen reached its zenith. Poets wrote of Gloriana, the ageless divine ruler who sacrificed her personal happiness for the good of her subjects. Her physical appearance became a mask. Layers of white makeup, elaborate wigs, and gowns encrusted with symbolic pearls. But beneath the artifice, the woman remained an enigma. As we begin our journey into her life, we must ask, was the Virgin Queen a title of honor, a political necessity, or a mask for a woman who lived a life far more complex and scandalous than history dares to admit? To understand the myth of the Virgin Queen, we must first look back to the traumatic childhood of Elizabeth Tudor. Born into a court where a queen's value was tied solely to her ability to produce a male heir, young Elizabeth witnessed the ultimate cost of failure. Her father, Henry VIII, had her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. This foundational trauma instilled a deep-seated association between marriage, sex, and death. In the dark, drafty hallways of her youth, the girl who would be king learned that for a woman in power, the heart was a dangerous liability. The execution of Anne Boleyn was only the beginning of Elizabeth's education in the brutality of men. As Henry VIII cycled through wives, some discarded, some dying in childbirth, another beheaded, Elizabeth saw the crown not as a symbol of romantic union, but as a precarious seat of survival. She was declared a bastard, stripped of her titles, and forced to navigate a world where her very existence was a political inconvenience. These early years forged a mind that was sharp, cynical, and intensely private. The young princess realized that to remain safe, one had to remain unattached and utterly inscrutable. After the sudden death of her father, a teenage princess found herself placed under the care of a powerful noble household. What followed would become one of the earliest shadows cast over her young life. Within that household, rumors began to circulate about inappropriate familiarity between the young royal and an ambitious senior courtier. Accounts from the time describe early morning visits and behavior that many considered improper, though the full truth remains debated by historians. Whether exaggerated by political enemies or rooted in genuine misconduct, the whispers threatened to damage her reputation long before she ever approached the throne. She was compelled to defend her honor against mounting speculation. learning at an early age that survival in court required caution, restraint, and silence. The Seymour scandal led to a grueling interrogation. Elizabeth, though only 15, displayed a precocious and terrifying intelligence. Facing the investigator Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, she refused to crumble, weaving a narrative of innocence that protected both her life and her future. She learned a vital lesson during these dark days. A woman's reputation was a political weapon that could be seized by her enemies. From this moment on, Elizabeth Tudor would never truly trust another man. She began to cultivate the image of the chaste, untouchable maiden, a mask that would eventually become her most powerful shield against the world. When her half-sister Mary I ascended the throne, Elizabeth's life hung by a thread. As a Protestant figurehead, she was a direct threat to Mary's Catholic restoration. Accused of involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion, Elizabeth was sent to the Tower of London, entering through the ominous Traitor's Gate. In the cold, damp shadows of the fortress, she lived in constant fear of the executioner's axe, the same fate that had claimed her mother. The psychological toll of these months was immense, cementing her belief that a husband was not a partner, but a potential master who could lead her to the block. Inside the tower, Elizabeth was surrounded by the ghosts of the fallen. Every footfall in the corridor could be the guard coming to take her to the scaffold. She watched from her narrow window as others were led to their deaths, realizing that in the Game of Thrones, there was no room for sentiment. Her survival depended on her ability to outthink and outlast her rivals. She became a master of ambiguity, never committing to a single path, never giving her enemies a clear target. This period of intense isolation sharpened her resolve to never let another human being hold power over her life. In 1558, the bells of London rang out for a new age. Mary was dead, and Elizabeth was queen. At 25, she was the focus of the world's gaze, a young woman inheriting a bankrupt, religiously fractured kingdom. During her coronation, the weight of the crown was both literal and symbolic. She was now the most eligible bachelorette in Europe, and the pressure to marry and secure the succession began immediately. Her advisors, led by the pragmatic William Cecil, viewed her womb as a state asset. But Elizabeth had other plans. She had seen the price her mother and sisters paid for marriage. The Privy Council was relentless. They argued that a queen regnant was a contradiction in terms. A woman was too weak to rule alone and needed a husband to provide military and political stability. Elizabeth listened to their petitions with a practiced, enigmatic smile. She allowed them to debate potential suitors, kings, archdukes, and princes, using the prospect of her hand as a diplomatic carrot to keep foreign powers at bay. It was a masterclass in political manipulation. By remaining unmarried, she kept everyone guessing and maintained her autonomy, though the personal cost of this loneliness began to settle in the deep shadows of the palace. Amidst the political calculations, one man stood apart: Robert Dudley. A childhood friend who had shared the terrors of the Tower with her, Dudley was the only man Elizabeth truly seemed to love. He was her master of the horse, constantly by her side, their chemistry palpable to everyone at court. The rumors were scandalous, that they were lovers, that they had secret children, that he was the true king in all but name. For the first time, the Virgin Queen mask slipped. In the flickering candlelight of her private chambers, Elizabeth faced a choice between her heart and her crown. The romance with Dudley hit a catastrophic wall in 1560 with the mysterious death of his wife, Amy Robsart. Found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs with a broken neck, Amy's passing sparked a firestorm of suspicion. Was it an accident, suicide, or a calculated murder to clear the way for Dudley to marry the Queen? The scandal made marriage to Dudley politically impossible. Elizabeth was forced to choose between the man she loved and the stability of her throne. In the wake of Amy's death, the legend of the Virgin Queen began to solidify, not out of desire, but out of necessity. In the wake of the Dudley scandal, Elizabeth realized her power lay in being unattainable. She began to craft a public persona that equated her virginity with her divinity, telling Parliament she was already wed to the Kingdom of England. This wasn't just a political pivot. It was a total transformation of her identity. The whispers of Dudley's dead wife still haunted the corridors, but Elizabeth's gaze was now fixed on the future. She would use her single status as a diplomatic weapon, dangling her hand in marriage to keep foreign powers at bay for decades to come. As the 1560s progressed, Europe's kings circled like vultures. King Eric XIV of Sweden sent extravagant gifts, while Archduke Charles of Austria offered a Catholic alliance. To Elizabeth, these men were not potential partners, but pawns on a chessboard. She flirted, delayed, and equivocated, masterfully playing one against the other. Each suitor believed he was the one to finally tame the English queen, unaware that she had no intention of ever sharing her crown. The dance of diplomacy became her most elaborate and successful masquerade, ensuring that no foreign power could claim her or her throne through a wedding bed. In 1562, disaster struck in the form of smallpox. The Queen fell deathly ill at Hampton Court, her life hanging by a thread. The nation held its breath. Without a husband or an heir, her death would trigger a bloody civil war. As she lay shivering in her bed, her counselors panicked in the next room, debating who should take the throne if she perished. This brush with mortality exposed the terrifying fragility of the Tudor line and intensified the pressure for her to marry. The Virgin Queen was a romantic idea, but a dead one was a national catastrophe. Elizabeth survived the smallpox, but the disease left its mark. Legend says it scarred her skin, prompting the transition to the iconic mask of youth. She began using Venetian ceruse, a lead-based white makeup, to hide any imperfections and maintain the illusion of eternal purity. This white face became her armor, a literal wall between her human self and the goddess she was becoming. The Gloriana cult was born from these scars. She was no longer just a woman. She was an icon, a white-faced marble statue that commanded the absolute devotion of her subjects, hiding her true self. William Cecil, her closest advisor, watched this transformation with growing anxiety. He was a pragmatist who saw the Virgin Queen myth as a dangerous gamble. Cecil spent hours over parchment maps and secret reports, desperately trying to arrange a Protestant match that would secure the succession. He feared that her refusal to marry would lead to a Catholic invasion or an internal coup. The tension between the Queen's personal autonomy and Cecil's political duty created a silent war within the court. The palace walls, thick with secrets, seemed to close in as the years passed without a royal child. North of the border, a new threat emerged: Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was young, beautiful, and most importantly, she had produced an heir, James. Mary's existence was a constant reminder of Elizabeth's failure to perform her traditional female duty. Catholic Europe looked to Mary as the rightful Queen of England, viewing Elizabeth as a bastard and a heretic. The contrast was sharp. Mary was the mother and the lover, while Elizabeth was the sterile, distant virgin. This rivalry would define the next 2 decades, turning the Virgin Queen image into a defensive fortress against her cousin's dynastic claims. To counter the threat of Mary and the pressure to wed, Elizabeth's court began a massive propaganda campaign. They portrayed her as Diana, the chaste goddess of the moon, and Astrea, the virgin of justice. This wasn't just art. It was state-sponsored mythology designed to elevate her virginity from a biological state to a divine virtue. She was presented as a celestial being who had sacrificed her personal happiness for the good of her people. The Virgin Queen was no longer a woman who couldn't find a husband. She was a deity who simply did not need one to rule. Despite the divine image, Elizabeth's court remained a place of intense, flirtatious energy. She surrounded herself with handsome young men, most notably Christopher Hatton, who caught her eye with his graceful dancing. Hatton was known as the Dancing Chancellor, and his relationship with Elizabeth was filled with intimate letters and pet names. He remained unmarried his whole life, leading many to wonder if his devotion was more than just political. Even as she aged, Elizabeth demanded the adoration of her favorites, maintaining a courtly romance that allowed her to be loved without ever being possessed by any man. As the years passed without a physical relationship, darker rumors began to circulate among foreign ambassadors. Some whispered that Elizabeth had a secret physical impediment that made sexual intercourse or childbirth impossible. These medical theories were fueled by her fierce refusal to allow her physicians to examine her closely. Was her virginity a choice, or a biological necessity she was forced to hide? These whispers traveled across the courts of Europe, suggesting that the Virgin Queen was a facade built to conceal a secret that could undermine her very legitimacy as a woman and as a Tudor monarch. Elizabeth eventually began to adopt the language of a male monarch to solidify her authority. She famously declared that while she had the body of a weak woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. This rhetorical shift was the final piece of the Virgin Queen puzzle. By transcending her gender, she moved beyond the expectations of marriage and motherhood. She was the prince of her people, a singular entity that existed above the messy realities of human biology. The woman Elizabeth was fading, replaced by the eternal, untouchable sovereign who would rule her kingdom alone. As the political myth of the Virgin Queen took hold, the physical reality of Elizabeth began to transform. To maintain the illusion of eternal, unblemished purity, she turned to Venetian ceruse, a lethal mixture of white lead and vinegar. This thick, toxic paste became her daily armor, masking the scars of age and illness. In the dim light of her private chambers, her ladies-in-waiting applied the porcelain layer, creating a literal mask that separated the human woman from the divine sovereign. This cosmetic ritual was more than vanity. It was statecraft. The whiter her skin, the more she appeared as a celestial being, untouched by the common decay of mortality. Behind the heavy oak doors of the royal bedchamber, the public persona of the Virgin Queen often crumbled. This was a space of intense intimacy and terrifying secrecy, governed by the ladies of the bedchamber. These women were the gatekeepers of Elizabeth's body, the only ones who saw her without her wigs, her padding, or her leaden paint. If Elizabeth truly carried a secret, a hidden lover, a physical deformity, or even the remnants of a clandestine pregnancy, it was these women who held the keys to the kingdom's stability. Their silence was bought with total devotion, creating a sisterhood of shadows where the line between queen and woman was blurred. Despite her carefully guarded privacy, rumors of Elizabeth's biological irregularities began to circulate in the dark corners of the court. One of the most persistent legends suggests that the real Elizabeth died as a child in the village of Bisley and was replaced by a look-alike boy to avoid the wrath of King Henry VIII. Proponents of this Bisley boy theory point to her refusal to see doctors and her preference for high-collared clothing. While historians largely dismiss this as folklore, the very existence of such a tale highlights the deep-seated cultural suspicion that a woman could not possibly rule with such singular, sexless authority without a hidden, masculine secret. Foreign powers were obsessed with the state of the queen's body, viewing her fertility as a matter of international security. The Spanish ambassador, de Silva, was tasked with uncovering the truth. He cultivated spies within the palace, desperate for reports on Elizabeth's menstrual cycle or any signs of physical weakness. In his secret dispatches to King Philip II, he painted a portrait of a woman who was both cunning and physically fragile. Every cough, every faint, and every missed public appearance was scrutinized. To the world, Elizabeth's womb was a political battleground, and her refusal to produce an heir was seen as a deliberate act of defiance against the natural order. In October 1562, the myth of the Virgin Queen nearly came to a premature end. Elizabeth fell dangerously ill with smallpox at Hampton Court. As she lay drifting in and out of consciousness, the government panicked. Without an heir, England faced the prospect of a bloody civil war. During her recovery, the Queen's face was left pitted with scars, a physical reminder of her mortality that she would spend the rest of her life hiding. This brush with death reinforced her resolve to remain unmarried. She realized that her body was the only thing standing between peace and chaos, and she could not risk it in the perils of childbirth. As the years passed, Elizabeth's physical transformation became more pronounced. The red hair of her youth was replaced by elaborate, vibrant wigs, and her blackened teeth, rotted by a love of sugar, were often hidden by a stoic, closed-mouth expression. She began to use the mask of youth, a standardized portraiture style that ignored the effects of time. No artist was permitted to paint her as she truly appeared. Instead, they reproduced the same ageless face. This was the birth of the Virgin Queen as an icon, a frozen, unchanging symbol that existed outside of time. The woman was disappearing behind a wall of gold and lead, becoming a living statue. To solidify her image, Elizabeth's court promoted the cult of Gloriana, using classical and biblical allegories to explain her virginity. She was depicted as Astrea, the goddess of justice, or Diana, the virgin huntress. Symbols like the ermine, representing purity, and the sieve, representing the ability to discern good from evil, appeared in her portraits. These were not mere artistic choices. They were philosophical arguments for her right to rule alone. By aligning herself with these powerful celibate figures, she turned her lack of a husband into a divine attribute. She was not a woman who had failed to marry. She was a goddess who had chosen a higher path. Robert Dudley, the man who had loved her since childhood, eventually realized that the crown would always come before him. Even as he remained her closest advisor, the hope of marriage faded into a bittersweet friendship. Their relationship, once a source of scandal, became a cornerstone of her stability. Dudley's presence provided the emotional support she needed to endure the isolation of her position. However, his frustration often boiled over as he watched her age without an heir, knowing that the Virgin Queen persona was a prison of their own making. Their bond was a testament to the heavy personal cost Elizabeth paid to maintain her singular authority. The question of Elizabeth's virginity often leads to modern speculation about her biology. Some historians and medical experts have proposed that she may have suffered from conditions like androgen insensitivity syndrome, which would have made her appear female, but left her unable to conceive. Others suggest a psychological trauma, rooted in the execution of her mother and the predatory behavior of Thomas Seymour during her youth. created a lifelong aversion to the physical act of intimacy. Whether the cause was biological, psychological, or purely political, the result was the same. A queen who successfully navigated a world of men by refusing to be defined by her role as a wife. By the final decade of her reign, the Virgin Queen was no longer a person, but an unshakable national identity. Elizabeth had become the mother of England, replacing the biological family she never had with an entire kingdom. Her subjects saw her as a steadfast protector who had sacrificed her personal happiness for their security. The young, vulnerable princess who had once trembled in the Tower of London was now the old lioness, a ruler whose power was absolute because it was solitary. The mask was complete. The woman Elizabeth was gone, replaced by an eternal sovereign who would be remembered not for who she loved, but for how she ruled alone. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Gloriana facade began to weigh heavily on the aging queen. Behind the closed doors of her private chambers, the vibrant image of the Virgin Queen was a taxing illusion to maintain. Elizabeth suffered from chronic ailments, her teeth blackening from sugar and her skin scarred by smallpox. The reflection in the mirror was no longer the radiant sun of England, but a woman haunted by time. Every morning, a small army of ladies-in-waiting labored to reconstruct the myth, applying layers of thick white lead to a face that felt increasingly like a tomb. The mask of youth was not merely a metaphor, it was a physical necessity. To keep the illusion of eternal sovereignty alive, Elizabeth utilized Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar. This toxic paste created a porcelain-smooth surface, hiding the imperfections of age, but it slowly poisoned her body. Her ladies painted her lips with vermilion and drew blue veins on her hands to suggest the delicate translucency of youth. This daily ritual was a grueling performance of statecraft, transforming a frail human into a living icon, a divine statue that could never be seen to decay by her subjects. Into this world of artifice stepped Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. Young, charismatic, and dangerously ambitious, he became the Queen's final obsession. Their relationship was a complex dance of power and affection, a strange echo of her long-lost romance with Robert Dudley. To the aging Queen, Essex represented the youth and vitality she had sacrificed for the crown. To Essex, Elizabeth was a fading sun whose favor was a ladder to ultimate power. Their late-night conversations, filled with poetry and political maneuvering, revitalized the Queen, yet the whispers of the court warned of a dangerous imbalance. The dynamic between Elizabeth and Essex grew increasingly volatile. He was not a courtier who knew his place. He was a man who challenged the Queen's authority. Essex's arrogance led to public disputes that tested Elizabeth's legendary patience. He famously turned his back on her during a Privy Council meeting, leading her to cuff him on the ear and tell him to go and be hanged. This was no longer the courtly love of her youth, but a clash of generations and temperaments. The mask of the Virgin Queen was being pushed to its limits by the very man who claimed to serve her. The breaking point occurred in 1599. After a failed military campaign in Ireland, a desperate Essex burst into the Queen's bedchamber at Nonsuch Palace before she was ready for the day. He saw the woman behind the myth, without her wig, without her makeup, her gray hair thin and hanging about her shoulders. This breach of royal protocol was a fatal mistake. For Elizabeth, to be seen in her true, vulnerable state was an unforgivable intrusion into her carefully constructed identity. The spell was broken. The Virgin Queen could not coexist with the reality of an aging woman in the eyes of an ambitious subordinate. Essex's fall was swift and violent. Stripped of his offices and his wealth, he attempted a desperate coup against the Queen's advisors in 1601. The rebellion was a spectacular failure, lasting only a few hours before he was arrested for high treason. For Elizabeth, the betrayal was deeply personal. The man she had doted upon had turned his sword against her crown. The Mother of England was forced to realize that her favorites were often motivated by the very power she wielded alone. The court watched in silence as the Queen retreated further into her isolation. Her heart hardened by this final, bitter disappointment. The duty of sovereignty demanded a final, agonizing decision. Elizabeth was forced to sign the death warrant for Robert Devereux. Historians note that she hesitated for days, her hand shaking as she hovered over the parchment. The execution of a man she had once held in such high regard was the ultimate sacrifice for the stability of her realm. When the axe finally fell, a part of Elizabeth died with him. She became increasingly melancholy, often sitting in the dark for hours, refusing to speak. The old lioness was weary, the burden of being a symbol for nearly 45 years finally taking its toll. By early 1603, Elizabeth's health was failing rapidly. She moved to Richmond Palace, her warm winter box, but she refused to seek the comfort of her bed. Legend says she stood for 15 hours straight, leaning on her ladies, fearing that if she lay down, she would never rise again. She was a queen who had spent her life standing against the tide of history, and she would not surrender her posture even at the end. Her counselors whispered in the hallways, the air thick with the realization that the Elizabethan era was drawing to its inevitable close. The myth was finally meeting its mortal end. In her final days, the coronation ring, the symbol of her marriage to the Kingdom of England, had grown so tight that it had begun to grow into her flesh. It had to be filed off, a symbolic divorce from the realm she had served so faithfully. This act marked the transition from the eternal sovereign back to a mortal woman. Elizabeth grew silent, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, gesturing for music to be played to soothe her passing. The Virgin Queen was letting go of the world she had shaped, leaving behind a legacy of independence that would define the British identity for centuries to come. On March 24, 1603, the great bell of St. Paul's tolled to announce the death of Elizabeth I. She died as she had lived, mysterious, solitary, and absolute. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, ending the Tudor dynasty forever. While the woman was gone, the legend of the Virgin Queen was only just beginning. She had transformed the limitation of her gender into a source of divine power, proving that a woman could rule alone and leave a kingdom stronger than she found it. The mystery of her private life would remain buried with her, a secret kept by the most successful mask in history. The streets of London were draped in black. Tens of thousands gathered to witness the end of an era. The funeral of Elizabeth I was a somber, silent affair, as her effigy lay atop the coffin, looking as lifelike as the woman who had captivated a nation. For 44 years, she had been the sun around which England orbited. As the procession wound toward Westminster, the question that had plagued her court for decades did not vanish. It simply grew quieter, waiting for the dust of history to settle before rising again in the minds of scholars. Within the hallowed, shadow-filled arches of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was laid to rest. She was placed in the same vault as her half-sister, Mary I, enemies in life, now united in the cold silence of the stone. The monument eventually erected over her showed a queen in repose, her hands clasped in eternal prayer. But even in death, her body was shielded from the prying eyes of the world. No autopsy was performed, no physical secrets revealed. The marble effigy became the final barrier between the curious public and the truth of her biological life. Under King James I, the Tudor legacy was carefully curated. The Virgin Queen became a symbol of a lost golden age, a contrast to the fiscal and political struggles of the Stuart dynasty. Historians began to sift through the mountains of state papers, yet they found more questions than answers. The letters between Elizabeth and her favorites, like the Earl of Leicester, were filled with coded language and emotional depth. Was she a master of platonic devotion, or a woman who had successfully navigated the most dangerous scandals to emerge with her reputation intact? Decades later, the whispers regarding Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, remained the most persistent. Their relationship was the foundation of the skepticism surrounding her virginity. They had been close since childhood, sharing a bond forged in the fires of the Tower of London. When Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances, the world waited for a marriage that never came. Historians argue that the political fallout of a marriage would have been ruinous, suggesting that if they were lovers, it was a secret they carried to their respective graves. As the centuries passed, more radical theories emerged to explain Elizabeth's iron resolve and refusal to marry. One of the most bizarre legends is that of the Bisley boy. The story claims that the young Princess Elizabeth died of a fever in the village of Bisley and was replaced by a look-alike local boy to avoid the wrath of King Henry VIII. Proponents point to her wigs, high collars, and her alleged refusal to be seen by physicians as evidence of a lifelong deception. While dismissed by serious historians, the myth highlights the lengths people went to explain her mystery. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth was notoriously protective of her physical privacy. She often refused the examinations of royal physicians, preferring to diagnose herself or rely on trusted ladies-in-waiting. This medical secrecy fueled rumors that she suffered from a physical condition that made childbearing impossible or sexual relations traumatic. Some theorists suggest a physiological anomaly was the true reason she never wed, using her virgin branding as a brilliant political cover for a biological reality she could never acknowledge without losing her status and her throne. Elizabeth understood the power of the image long before the age of mass media. Her portraits were carefully managed masks of youth that never aged, even as she entered her final years. These paintings, filled with symbolic icons like pearls for purity and phoenixes for rebirth, were the visual foundation of her Virgin Queen persona. In the candlelit galleries of the nobility, these images stood as silent sentinels, reinforcing her divine right and her untouchable nature. The portraiture was not art. It was a sophisticated defensive wall built of pigment and gold leaf. The contrast between Elizabeth and her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, provides a stark lesson in Tudor survival. Mary followed her heart, marrying for love and passion, and ended up losing her crown, her freedom, and eventually her head. Elizabeth watched Mary's downfall with a keen, calculating eye. She saw how a husband could become a rival or a liability. If Elizabeth did sacrifice her personal desires, it was a calculated exchange for the safety of her realm. The Virgin was a political fortress that no king could ever breach. In the modern era, the mystery remains a subject of intense academic debate. While modern science could potentially solve the mystery through DNA testing of her remains, the British monarchy has consistently refused requests to exhume her body. Elizabeth remains undisturbed in Westminster, her secrets protected by centuries of tradition and royal protocol. This refusal only adds to the allure of the mystery. Was there a child? Was there a physical secret? Without modern forensic evidence, the world is left with nothing but the testimonies of those who lived 400 years ago. Ultimately, whether Elizabeth I was a literal virgin matters less than the fact that she convinced the world she was. She took the vulnerability of being a lone female ruler and turned it into a cult of personality that has lasted centuries. The mask she wore, the white-faced, jewel-encrusted icon, was her greatest achievement. It allowed her to rule with the authority of a man and the mystique of a goddess. The Virgin Queen was her masterpiece, a historical enigma that remains as vibrant and impenetrable today as it was in the 16th century. With the death of Elizabeth in 1603, the Tudor line came to an abrupt, silent end. As the great queen breathed her last at Richmond Palace, a heavy hush fell over the court. For 44 years, she had been the sun around which all English life orbited, her perceived purity a cornerstone of national identity. Now, as the courtiers whispered in the dim hallways, the question that had been suppressed for decades began to surface with renewed intensity. What secrets did she take to her grave? The mask of state was finally set aside, leaving only the cold reality of a mortal woman who had outlived all her contemporaries. Even as the Queen's body grew cold, Sir Robert Cecil was already moving to secure the succession. For years, secret letters had traveled between London and Edinburgh, bypassing Elizabeth's direct control. James VI of Scotland was to be the heir, bringing a new dynasty to the English throne. This transition marked more than just a change in ruler. It was the beginning of an era where Elizabeth's life would be scrutinized, without the fear of her wrath. The new king's arrival brought fresh eyes to the inner sanctum of the Tudor court, where the legends of the Virgin Queen would either be upheld or dismantled by those eager to please their new master. The preparation of the royal body for burial was a task of immense gravity and secrecy. Royal physicians and embalmers were granted access to the physical form that had been guarded so fiercely during her life. Reports from the time are sparse, yet they remain a focal point for those seeking proof of her chastity. If Elizabeth had ever borne a child, as some whispered, the physical evidence would have been visible to these men. However, the official record remained as polished as her public persona. The silence of the embalmers only fueled the speculative fires of future generations, as the boundary between woman and icon remained blurred even in death. A wax funeral effigy was created to represent the Queen during her lying in state. This lifelike figure, dressed in her finest robes and adorned with her signature jewels, served as a final reinforcement of her Gloriana image. It was this version of Elizabeth, the ageless, majestic virgin, that the public was allowed to mourn. The effigy captured the sharp features and the regal bearing that had intimidated ambassadors and inspired poets. By presenting this idealized form, the government ensured that the legacy of the Virgin Queen would remain intact, even as the physical body beneath it succumbed to the natural processes of decay, further distancing the truth from the myth. The funeral procession of Elizabeth I was a spectacle of somber magnificence. On a cold April night, the barge carrying her coffin moved slowly down the Thames, flanked by black-clad mourners. Thousands of Londoners lined the banks, weeping for the only monarch most had ever known. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of torches and the sound of muffled drums. This was the final performance of the Virgin Queen, a theatrical departure that cemented her status as a national deity. In the flickering torchlight, the distinction between the woman who had lived and the legend she had created seemed to dissolve into the dark waters of the river. With the House of Stuart now on the throne, the narrative around Elizabeth began to shift. James I, seeking to establish his own legitimacy, often found himself living in the shadow of his predecessor's immense popularity. While he praised her memory publicly, privately, the new court was rife with gossip that would have been treasonous just months earlier. The rigid control Elizabeth had maintained over her image was gone. scholars and courtiers began to revisit the old rumors of her favorites, Dudley, Hatton, and Essex, viewing them through a lens of skepticism that her own powerful presence had previously held at bay. The myth was entering its first phase of historical trial. In the decades following her death, hidden caches of letters and state papers began to surface, offering a more intimate look at the Queen's life. Some of these documents revealed a woman who was deeply emotional, prone to jealousy, and capable of intense affection. Her correspondence with Robert Dudley, in particular, showed a vulnerability that contradicted the stoic, virgin persona. While none of these letters provided a smoking gun regarding her physical chastity, they humanized the icon. The more historians dug into the archives, the more they found a ruler who used the ambiguity of her private life as a tool for survival in a world of cutthroat diplomacy. The debate over Elizabeth's virginity was not merely a matter of salacious gossip. It was a debate about the nature of female power in the 16th century. Critics argued that a woman could not rule effectively without a husband's guidance, while Elizabeth's supporters pointed to her purity as evidence of her divine right. As the 17th century progressed, she became a symbol of a lost, golden age, a standard against which the perceived failings of the Stuart kings were measured. Her virginity became a political weapon, used by those who wished to romanticize the past and critique the present, further complicating the search for the real woman behind the white lead makeup. Even in the modern era, the mystery persists, with some historians suggesting that Elizabeth may have suffered from physical conditions that made traditional marriage or childbirth impossible. This theory posits that her virginity might have been a necessity transformed into a virtue. Others argue that she was a master of self-denial, sacrificing her personal happiness for the stability of her kingdom. Without modern forensic evidence, which is unlikely to ever be permitted, we are left to interpret the fragments of her life. The lack of a definitive answer is perhaps the most fitting tribute to a woman who spent her entire life maintaining a carefully constructed wall between her public self and her private truth. Today, Elizabeth I rests in Westminster Abbey, sharing a tomb with her half-sister, Mary I. The inscription on their monument speaks of them as partners in throne and grave, yet in the public imagination, they could not be more different. Mary is remembered for her religious fervor, while Elizabeth remains the enigmatic Virgin Queen. Her tomb is a site of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the paradox of her reign. She remains the ultimate historical enigma, a woman who chose to be an icon rather than a wife, and whose true nature remains as impenetrable as the stone effigy that guards her final resting place. The mask, it seems, has become eternal. Though the stone effigy in Westminster remains silent, the archives of Europe tell a more turbulent story. For centuries, historians have sifted through the mountains of diplomatic correspondence, seeking the truth behind the Virgin Queen's carefully constructed facade. In the shadowy corners of the Vatican and the royal courts of Spain, whispers of a very different Elizabeth persisted, one whose chastity was a political weapon rather than a personal reality. These reports, often dismissed as mere propaganda, nonetheless painted a portrait of a woman deeply involved in the complex, dangerous games of the heart and power, where every secret held the weight of a kingdom. At the center of these whispers was one man, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Their connection was not merely one of courtly favor. It was a bond forged in the fires of shared childhood trauma and survival. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, Dudley was immediately appointed Master of the Horse, a position that kept him in constant, intimate proximity to the Queen. Observers noted their easy familiarity, their private walks in the gardens of Whitehall, and the way the Queen's eyes lingered upon him. To the court, Dudley was more than a favorite. He was the man who held the Queen's heart in a grip of iron. The primary obstacle to their union was Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart. Her sudden and mysterious death at Cumnor Place in 1560 sent shockwaves through the English court. Found at the bottom of a flight of stairs with a broken neck, rumors of foul play immediately swirled around Dudley and the Queen. The scandal was so immense that any hope of a legal marriage between Elizabeth and her favorite was effectively destroyed. The tragedy cast a long, dark shadow over Elizabeth's reign, forcing her to choose between the man she loved and the throne she was determined to protect at all costs. As the years passed, the rumors shifted from forbidden love to the possibility of secret offspring. In 1587, a man named Arthur Dudley appeared at the court of King Philip II of Spain, claiming to be the illegitimate son of Elizabeth and Leicester. He provided a detailed account of his birth at Hampton Court and his subsequent upbringing in secret. While many historians view his claim with skepticism, his presence in the Spanish records serves as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable Elizabeth's reputation was. The specter of a secret heir posed a terminal threat to the carefully curated image of the Virgin Queen. The Spanish ambassador de Silva and his successors were meticulous in their reporting of the Queen's private life. Their dispatches to Madrid were filled with coded observations regarding her physical health and her relationship with Dudley. They spoke of the singular way the Queen and Leicester behaved when they thought they were unobserved. These documents, preserved in the archives of Simancas, provide a voyeuristic window into a world of hidden corridors and whispered confidences. For the Spanish, Elizabeth's virginity was not a fact, but a facade that needed to be exposed to destabilize her Protestant rule. The Queen's physical health was a matter of intense state security. Her physicians were bound by oaths of absolute secrecy, and any mention of her reproductive health was treated as treasonous. Yet whispers persisted about her irregular cycles and her fear of childbirth, perhaps stemming from the fate of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Some modern theorists suggest that Elizabeth may have suffered from a physical condition that made intimacy difficult or impossible, adding another layer to the enigma. Whether her virginity was a choice or a biological necessity remains one of the most debated aspects of her complex life and legacy. In 1562, Elizabeth contracted smallpox, a moment that brought the kingdom to the brink of a succession crisis. As she lay in a feverish delirium, she reportedly begged her council to name Robert Dudley protector of the realm, confessing that although she loved him dearly, nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. This deathbed confession, if it can be called that, is often cited by those who believe in her chastity. However, skeptics point out that even in the throes of illness, Elizabeth was a master of self-presentation, aware that her words would be recorded for posterity and the survival of her throne. As the years went by, Elizabeth leaned further into the cult of Gloriana. She transformed herself from a woman into a goddess, an untouchable icon of national stability. Her portraits became increasingly stylized, her skin rendered as white as marble, her clothing a fortress of silk, jewels, and lace. This iconographic shield served to deflect gossip and cement her role as the mother of the English people. By marrying her nation instead of a man, she avoided the power struggles that had plagued her sister Mary and Mother Anne, ensuring that her authority remained absolute and her secrets remained buried deep beneath the surface. Modern historians continue to use every tool at their disposal, from infrared analysis of her portraits to forensic linguistic studies of her letters, to find a crack in the mask. Some believe they see hidden symbols of motherhood in certain paintings, such as the placement of a hand or the inclusion of a specific flower. Others argue that the absence of evidence is the evidence itself, In a court as gossipy as hers, a full-term pregnancy would have been impossible to hide. The debate remains a stalemate between the physical records of the time and the enduring psychological profile of a woman who valued control above all. Ultimately, the question of Elizabeth's virginity may be the wrong one to ask. Her virginity was a political masterstroke, a brilliant piece of branding that allowed her to rule alone in a world of men. Whether she was a virgin in the literal sense matters less than the fact that she successfully projected that image for 44 years. She understood that in the theater of monarchy, perception is reality. By remaining the Virgin Queen, she became a legend that could not be touched by the scandals of the flesh, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate, frustrate, and inspire centuries later. As the years turned into decades, the mask of the Virgin Queen became inseparable from the woman herself. Elizabeth realized that to be a monarch in a male-dominated Europe, she had to transcend her gender. She sacrificed the comforts of a traditional family for the security of a nation. Her private chambers were no longer a place of intimacy, but a strategic fortress. Every movement was choreographed, every word measured. She became a living icon, a secular saint who had wedded England itself. Yet, in the silence of the night, one wonders if she mourned the life she never lived. By the 1590s, the Golden Age was showing its age. Elizabeth's health began to decline, yet her image remained youthful on the coinage and in official portraits. This mask of youth was a necessary deception to maintain the illusion of an eternal, virginal ruler. Beneath the white lead makeup and the elaborate red wigs lay a tired woman who had outlived almost all her contemporaries. The contrast between the public goddess and the private, aging sovereign was a closely guarded secret, known only to her most loyal ladies-in-waiting, who swore oaths of absolute silence to protect the mystery. Rumors, however, are harder to bury than secrets. Even in her twilight years, the whispers of the Robert Dudley affair persisted. Some claimed they had secret children hidden away in the countryside. Others whispered that Dudley was the only man who truly knew the woman behind the crown. These stories fueled the imaginations of the court and foreign enemies alike. In the dark corners of the palace, gossips dissected her every past interaction, searching for a crack in the virginal armor. These rumors were the shadow that followed her legend, a reminder of the human desires she supposedly suppressed. Foreign ambassadors were obsessed with Elizabeth's body. The Spanish Bishop of Aquila wrote frantic dispatches to King Philip II, detailing every rumor of a pregnancy or a secret tryst. To the Catholic powers, proving Elizabeth was not a virgin wasn't just about scandal, it was about delegitimizing her rule. If she were immoral, her claim to the throne was spiritually forfeit. They employed spies to bribe her laundry maids and doctors, hoping to find physical evidence of her sins. Yet despite decades of intense surveillance, no smoking gun was ever found, leaving her enemies frustrated and her reputation intact. Perhaps the most bizarre theory to emerge was the Bisley Boy legend, which suggested that the real Elizabeth died as a child and was replaced by a local boy. While historians dismiss this as wild fantasy, its existence highlights the public's deep-seated need to explain her refusal to marry and her unfeminine strength. This conspiracy theory suggests that her virginity was actually a biological necessity to hide a male identity. Even as a myth, it underscores the profound mystery surrounding her person. In the world of historical intrigue, the truth is often less captivating than the stories we invent to fill the voids. Medical records from the Tudor era are sparse, leaving much to modern interpretation. Some historians speculate Elizabeth may have suffered from conditions like MRKH syndrome, which would have made sexual intercourse painful or impossible. This biological explanation offers a different perspective on her choice to remain a virgin. If she were physically unable to bear children, marriage would have been a political disaster, leading to an inevitable succession crisis. In this light, her branding as the Virgin Queen was not just a clever choice, but a brilliant adaptation to a biological reality that could have destroyed her. In March 1603, the end finally came at Richmond Palace. Elizabeth, the woman who had defied every expectation of her gender, lay dying. She refused to lie in bed, standing for hours in a state of melancholy before finally succumbing to the inevitable. As she lost her speech, she reportedly made a sign to confirm James VI of Scotland as her successor. With her death, the Tudor line ended. The Virgin Queen had remained wedded to her kingdom until her final breath, leaving the throne to the son of her greatest rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, and sealing her legacy forever. The transition to the Stuart dynasty brought a shift in how Elizabeth was remembered. King James I had to navigate the towering legacy of his predecessor. While he respected her memory, the courtly atmosphere changed from the cult of the Virgin Queen to a more traditional patriarchal rule. However, the public's nostalgia for good Queen Bess only grew. Her virginity became a symbol of a lost golden era of English independence and Protestant purity. Even as the new king took the throne, the shadow of the Virgin Queen loomed large over the halls of Westminster and Whitehall, a ghost that could not be silenced. Today, the debate continues among historians and enthusiasts alike. Was she a political genius, a biological anomaly, or simply a woman who chose independence over the shackles of a 16th-century marriage? Without modern forensic evidence, which is unlikely to ever be permitted, we are left with the evidence of her reign. She took a bankrupt, divided nation and left it a global power. Her virginity remains the ultimate historical cold case, a mystery protected by the passage of centuries and the deliberate obfuscation of a queen who knew how to keep a secret better than anyone in history. Ultimately, Elizabeth I remains an enigma, a figure who stands at the crossroads of history and myth. By choosing the path of the Virgin Queen, she ensured that her identity was tied solely to her crown, rather than to a husband or children. She became Astrea, the goddess of justice who returned to Earth to usher in a new age. Whether she was a virgin in the physical sense is a question that may never be answered, but her impact on the world is undeniable. She remains the defining symbol of British sovereignty, a queen who belonged to no man, but to history itself. Elizabeth's choice was not merely a personal one. It was a calculated political sacrifice that defined the Golden Age. By refusing to marry, she avoided the domestic turmoil that plagued her sister Mary and the fatal entrapments of her mother, Anne Boleyn. The crown became her husband, and the English people her children. This singular focus allowed her to navigate the treacherous waters of 16th-century European politics with unparalleled autonomy. She was the architect of her own image, a woman who understood that in the theater of power, perception is more potent than reality, and a queen's body was a vessel for the state. As the years advanced, the queen's public appearance became a meticulously crafted facade. The thick white lead makeup, the elaborate red wigs, and the jewel-encrusted gowns were more than fashion. They were psychological armor. Behind the mask of youth, the woman aged, but the queen remained eternal. This artifice served to bolster the cult of the Virgin Queen, maintaining the illusion of a goddess untouched by the ravages of time or the weaknesses of the flesh. In the dim light of her private chambers, the mask would fall, revealing the heavy toll of a lifetime spent under the scrutiny of an entire world. Despite her public devotion to celibacy, the shadows of the court were always filled with whispers. From the alleged secret children fathered by Robert Dudley to the scandalous rumors of the Bisley Boy changeling theory, the mystery of her private life provided endless fodder for her enemies. These stories, preserved in coded letters and diplomatic dispatches, suggest a woman who may have lived a far more complex life than the official record admits. Yet, the lack of definitive evidence only deepens the intrigue, making her the ultimate historical enigma, a puzzle whose pieces were intentionally scattered to the winds of time by a master of secrets. Elizabeth's virginity was her greatest diplomatic weapon. By remaining unattached, she kept the kings of Europe, from Philip II of Spain to the Duke of Anjou, in a state of perpetual anticipation. She used the promise of her hand as a carrot on a stick, stalling invasions and forging alliances without ever having to surrender her sovereignty. To marry was to submit, and Elizabeth had seen too many queens lose their heads or their thrones to the men they wed. Her celibacy was not a lack of passion, but a surplus of wisdom, a strategic masterstroke that preserved England's independence for nearly half a century. In the archives of the Vatican and the dusty shelves of English manor houses, historians continue to pore over the correspondence of her inner circle. The letters between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley are filled with a desperate, intimate longing that transcends mere courtly love. They speak of a bond that was soul-deep, yet constantly thwarted by the demands of the state. These documents reveal the human heart beating beneath the stiff corsets of the Elizabethan era, suggesting that while she may have been the Virgin Queen in title, she was a woman of profound and perhaps fulfilled desires in the safety of her most private moments. As Elizabeth lay on her deathbed in 1603, the Tudor line reached its quiet conclusion. She had no heir of her body, a fact that had once seemed a tragedy, but now appeared as a deliberate act of closure. By not producing a successor, she ensured that her reign would be remembered as a singular, peak moment in English history. The transition to the Stuart dynasty was a somber affair, marking the end of an era defined by a woman who chose the legacy of a nation over the lineage of a family. The Tudor rose withered, but its scent would linger for centuries. To her poets and flatterers, she was Astrea, the celestial virgin whose return signaled a new golden age. This mythic persona was a powerful tool of propaganda, elevating Elizabeth from a mere mortal monarch to a divine figurehead. By aligning herself with the goddess of justice and purity, she created a brand that was impervious to the scandals that typically plagued female rulers. This deification allowed her to transcend the gender roles of her time, ruling not as a woman, but as a personification of the state itself. The myth of the Virgin Queen was the ultimate victory of image over substance, a legend written in starlight. Modern historians and scientists have often speculated about the biological reality of Elizabeth's virginity. Some suggest she may have suffered from physical conditions that made intercourse impossible, while others point to the psychological trauma of her father's many wives as a reason for her aversion to marriage. Yet, without a physical examination that will never occur, these theories remain speculative. In many ways, the search for the truth misses the point. The power of Elizabeth I lies not in her physical state, but in the narrative she constructed and the world she built around that central, mysterious pillar of her identity. Why does the question of Elizabeth's virginity continue to fascinate us 4 centuries later? It is because it represents the ultimate intersection of the public and the private, the political and the personal. We are drawn to the idea of a woman who held the ultimate secret in a world where she was never alone. Her silence on the matter is her final act of defiance against the intrusive gaze of history. By keeping the world guessing, she maintained her power even from the grave, ensuring that she would never be fully known, categorized, or dismissed. The mystery is her true monument. In the end, Elizabeth I was exactly who she needed to be for England to survive and thrive. Whether she was a literal virgin or a woman who masterfully played the role, she became the defining symbol of British sovereignty. She belonged to no man, choosing instead to belong to history, to the cold marble of Westminster Abbey, and to the eternal fascination of the human spirit. The Virgin Queen remains a figure of light and shadow, a monarch who understood that some truths are better left in the dark, and that a legend, once forged, is far more durable than the flesh.